Bonsoir, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir aujourd'hui dans cette ambiance très chaleureuse. Donc pour cette audition, je voudrais d'abord remercier la Caisse des dépôts de nous accueillir. Alors, nous accueille dans ce lieu qui nous permet d'organiser cette audition et le débat qui va suivre. Je me présente, donc je suis Taoufik Swami, co-directeur de l'école d'urbanisme de Paris et co-titulaire de la chaire Aménager le Grand Paris avec Daniel Béard, qui est là-bas, qui fera un petit coucou. Donc la chaire a été, en deux mots, très rapidement, fondée il y a donc quelques mois, inaugurée au mois de juillet dernier, en partenariat entre l'école d'urbanisme de Paris et 5 partenaires qui sont les acteurs majeurs de l'aménagement du Grand Paris. Je vais commencer aujourd'hui par la Caisse des dépôts. La Société du Grand Paris Aménagement, SNI Grand Paris Habitat qui a changé récemment de nom, et les PIF. Alors c'est 6 organismes, 5 organismes opérationnels, 5 organismes en charge de l'aménagement et l'école d'urbanisme ont choisi de lancer la chaire parce qu'ils ont communément constaté qu'il y a un certain nombre de transformations des pratiques d'aménagement, c'est bien une chaire centrée sur l'aménagement, c'est-à-dire sur la fabrique de la ville. Ils ont constaté un certain nombre de changements de pratiques d'aménagement liés au passage vers l'aménagement métropolitain et liés aux dimensions, aux problématiques différentes que posait le Grand Paris. Donc nous avons choisi ensemble de lancer cette chaire pour prendre le temps, créer cet espace qu'est la chaire, de réflexion, de pause, dans le rythme trépidant que connaît ce territoire, ces institutions, ces organismes qui y travaillent, pour réfléchir à un certain nombre de changements, un certain nombre de transformations. Et pour cela, ensemble, on a choisi de structurer la chaire en 4 grands axes différents. Un premier axe porte sur la veille, c'est-à-dire qu'on va regarder, on a déjà commencé en fait à regarder les transformations de pratiques, notamment à travers des entretiens, des témoignages autour de parcours professionnels particuliers, de professionnels de l'aménagement qui ont eu des parcours qui sont pour nous particulièrement révélateurs. Cette veille se fait également à travers un certain nombre de travaux, notamment d'analyse, par exemple des réponses et tout le processus autour des appels à projets. En particulier, nous avons commencé en particulier par l'appel à projet Inventant la métropole. Et donc actuellement, il y a des travaux pour analyser à la fois les cahiers des charges, mais surtout les réponses et essayer de comprendre ce qui se transforme à la fois du côté de la maîtrise d'ouvrage, cette maîtrise d'ouvrage particulière qui se construit ou se reconstruit, et également du côté des groupements et de l'organisation des milieux professionnels concernés. Le deuxième axe, lui, c'est un axe autour de la formation, puisque cette chaire, je ne l'ai pas précisé, s'adosse énormément sur les activités pédagogiques de l'école. Donc il y a par exemple 2 ateliers qui portent l'un sur les ardoines et l'autre sur les innovations. Et nous sommes en train de mettre en place une formation spécifique sur l'impact de ces appels à projets sur l'organisation de la maîtrise d'ouvrage. Le troisième axe, c'est celui que nous allons, donc j'y reviendrai tout à l'heure, vivre aujourd'hui, sur l'international. Et le quatrième, lui, porte sur ce qu'on appelait l'ouverture à la société, le débat public. Et là aussi, en s'adossant à un certain nombre d'activités pédagogiques, nous organisons des conférences-débats. Et par exemple, un groupe d'étudiants a organisé une série de conférences-débats, la dernière s'est tenue hier d'ailleurs, sur l'aménagement, les Jeux Olympiques et leur insertion spatiale et territoriale. Et ils ont choisi de développer ce sujet à travers 3 entrées différentes, courageusement je dois dire, puisqu'ils ont choisi de traiter ce lien entre les JO et leurs équipements, leurs aménagements et le territoire local, à travers d'abord la question de l'art et l'aménagement, deuxièmement la question de l'alimentation et de l'aménagement des Jeux Olympiques, et troisièmement, c'est ce qu'on a vu hier, la question des équipements et des équipements numériques, du numérique et des grands équipements sportifs et de l'aménagement. À chaque fois, ils ont essayé d'explorer avec 5-6 personnalités différentes pour certains, peu habitués à discuter des questions d'aménagement, travaillant pour certains sur les questions d'art, des artistes également, d'autres travaillant sur la question de l'alimentation, certains étant tout simplement des producteurs alimentaires, et puis hier par exemple, un certain nombre de spécialistes de la question du numérique dans les équipements sportifs. Donc ils ont essayé d'explorer, et donc vous aurez l'occasion probablement soit de visionner, soit de lire les synthèses qui ressortiront de ces activités. Je reviens donc à notre troisième axe sur les auditions internationales que l'on va vivre aujourd'hui. Nous avons choisi d'explorer et de faire ce travail sur l'international à travers ce format particulier qui est celui de l'audition. Alors, évidemment, on a choisi ce format-là pour sentir que l'exercice va être très important et solennel. On a pensé évidemment aux auditions parlementaires. Pour poser des questions précises. Et le but du jeu n'est pas tellement de recapitaliser des enseignements. On a voulu inviter des personnes qui ont été impliquées de l'intérieur dans l'organisation d'un processus d'aménagement. Cette année, nous avons choisi de travailler sur les JO et plus largement, les grands événements pour les interroger sur le registre suivant. Comment on peut anticiper, comment on peut programmer à l'avance, comment on peut au mieux gérer cette question, ce paradoxe ou cette tension entre le fait d'aménager pour des événements exceptionnels qui ont des contraintes, qui ont des exigences, qui vont faire venir des flux très importants de personnes et faire en sorte que ces lieux, ces espaces, ces ensembles urbains qui vont être aménagés, quelques semaines après, quelques parfois jours après, vont devenir des espaces publics, des équipements publics tout à fait ordinaires, fonctionnant normalement dans le reste de la ville. Donc comment on anticipe, quels sont les écueils qui pourraient être évités, donc on a souhaité inviter à chaque fois. Donc on a une première séance il y a environ un mois sur l'IBA, et donc nous avons eu là un certain nombre de réponses sur l'IBA de Hambourg, et aujourd'hui nous allons essayer de mieux comprendre comment s'est passé de l'intérieur la préparation, parfois aussi l'impréparation de l'héritage et de ce qui se passe après les Jeux Olympiques du point de vue, encore une fois, de l'aménagement des espaces publics. Donc on a choisi de ne pas poser du tout la question des grands coûts, est-ce que ça va coûter 6 milliards, 12 milliards ou 20 milliards d'euros. Ce qui nous intéresse, c'est ce qui se passe dans les espaces et comment on peut éventuellement les anticiper. Donc je remercie Richard Brown d'avoir accepté de jouer le jeu de cette audition. Alors, avant de passer le micro au chef d'orchestre, donc au maître de cérémonie, Marcus Zepf, qui est le responsable de ce programme international et de ces auditions, donc il va vous expliquer comment ça marche.
Donc, je vous souhaite la bienvenue à cette audition internationale London Legacy Planning. Et dans un premier temps, je voudrais m'excuser pour le petit retard que nous avons eu, nous deux, Richard et moi. C'est vrai que lui, il est parti ce matin à 9h pour venir juste à l'instant. Donc, il a bravé tous les obstacles dans un premier temps de train de Brighton à Londres qui ne pouvait pas partir. Et ensuite, l'Eurostar qui avait du retard aussi. Mais on est très content. Il a finalement pu venir. Donc, en fait, aujourd'hui, on s'intéresse à comment planifier l'héritage des Jeux Olympiques de Londres. Moi-même, je m'appelle Marcus Zepf. Vous entendez certainement mon petit accent germanique, donc bavarois d'origine. Si jamais vous m'entendez pas bien ou j'ai un accent trop prononcé bavarois, vous me le dites, s'il vous plaît, tout de suite. Et je suis depuis septembre professeur d'urbanisme à l'école d'urbanisme de Paris. Et donc j'ai l'honneur d'être le responsable scientifique de ces auditions internationales. Comme Taoufik l'a déjà mentionné, nous avons commencé la dernière audition sur le projet de la IBA à Hambourg, Sprung über die Elbe. Et M. Kellner, qui était en fait le directeur de l'époque, nous a expliqué en fait les 3 phases d'élaboration de ce projet. Dans un premier temps, quelle était l'idée en fait de cette forme d'expérimentation et ensuite quelles étaient les incertitudes de planification aussi pendant la mise en place des prototypes de ce programme expérimental territorial. Et la troisième phase, en fait, qui est une phase qui nous intéresse davantage, qui est celle de la gestion de l'héritage d'un grand événement et les questions qui se posent pour en fait traduire un événement particulier en espace de vie ordinaire. Donc l'objectif c'est donc d'analyser différents types de réalisations, IBA, les Jeux Olympiques de Londres. Nous allons continuer prochainement avec des voyages en Chine, dans un premier temps à Pékin, pour voir comment se sont déroulés les projets des Jeux Olympiques à Pékin, mais aussi à Shanghai sur la question de l'exposition internationale. Et donc, ce qui nous intéresse, c'est comment ces événements exceptionnels permettent en fait un aménagement des espaces à la fois extra et ordinaires. Autrement dit, comment concevoir et programmer des espaces capables de prendre en charge des événements tout en devenant des lieux de vie les plus ordinaires par la suite. Donc, le principe sur lequel nous avons travaillé et qui évolue au fur et à mesure encore, d'audition à audition, c'est de choisir un expert qui nous parle en fait d'un événement international et qui est accompagné d'une commission composée à la fois de praticiens et de chercheurs qui, en fait, dans un premier temps, vont auditionner notre expert et lui poser des questions pointues sur les trois phases. Donc notre expert d'aujourd'hui, c'est Dr. Richard Brown, Research Director du Centre for London. Et il a un parcours très impressionnant. On a encore discuté pendant tout le trajet de RER jusqu'à arriver maintenant. Donc il était entre 2001 et 2004 responsable de la London's Architecture and Urbanism Unit pour le compte du maire de Londres et a mis en place notamment des projets de localisation pour les Jeux de Londres 2012. Par la suite, entre 2004 et 2005, il était directeur du projet des Jeux Olympiques pour le compte du maire, toujours, et il était responsable à la traduction en fait, des objectifs politiques dans le projet. En 2005, il est devenu directeur du Transition Planning au département de la culture et responsable des stratégies et réalisations pour la transition en fait de ces espaces entre l'événement et l'après-événement. Et en 2005 et 2006, il était directeur des relations avec les porteurs d'intérêt, les stakeholders, de l'autorité pour la réalisation des Jeux Olympiques à Londres, donc en charge de mettre en place des relations avec différents groupes d'acteurs importants. Et entre 2008 et 2014, il était directeur du programme et directeur de la stratégie à la fois à l'Agence de développement de Londres et à la Corporation pour le développement de l'héritage pour Londres. Donc un parcours très impressionnant qui montre qu'il a acquis en fait un savoir qui est à la fois relatif aux questions politiques du grand projet, mais aussi aux questions techniques et de la mise en œuvre stratégique des Jeux Olympiques et de son héritage. Et donc, je le remercie beaucoup qu'il a pris le temps, entre toutes ses activités, de venir chez nous et débattre de cette expérience. Autrement, je voudrais brièvement présenter donc la commission qui s'est constituée pour aujourd'hui. Donc, il y a des collègues et les amis nombreux qui sont venus. Je les remercie d'avoir pris le temps de débattre avec nous. Donc je cite les noms, donc Franck Baltzer de l'établissement public foncier de l'Île-de-France, Catherine Barbet, Société du Grand Paris, Daniel Béard, École d'urbanisme de Paris, Jean-François Doulet, École d'urbanisme de Paris, Martine Drôdz du LADS, Clotilde Kuhlmann, que vous avez déjà vu, de l'École d'urbanisme de Paris aussi, Isabelle Laudier de la Caisse des dépôts, Pauline Lavaux de Grand Paris Aménagement, Damien Lerbet de l'établissement public foncier de l'Île-de-France, Anna Perrault du Grand Paris Aménagement, Jean-Dominique Piani de la Caisse de France, Lucie Renoux, Caisse de dépôt également, Alexandra Rossi, Grand Paris Habitat, Clotilde Saint-Hilaire du groupe SNI, et Taoufik et moi. Donc vous voyez un panel assez impressionnant. Et last but not least, je voudrais aussi remercier le public qui s'est libéré cet après-midi et que j'invite aussi à participer très fortement à nos échanges cet après-midi. Donc pour ne pas éterniser mon discours, je vais brièvement énoncer le phasage en fait de ces 2 heures qui suivent maintenant. Donc, principalement, nous allons écouter 3 temps d'intervention de Richard Brown. Donc, dans un premier temps, sur les questions de mise en place de la stratégie des Jeux olympiques et des incertitudes. Ensuite, un temps sur les gestions des impacts durant la réalisation et l'adaptation. Et finalement, la transition d'un espace extraordinaire vers un quartier accueillant en fait une vie du quartier contemporain. Donc, sans tarder, merci beaucoup Richard, et je te passe la parole.
Merci Marcus, je vous remercie beaucoup pour l'invitation. C'est très bon d'être ici et avoir l'opportunité de penser, réfléchir, c'est le mot juste, je ne sais pas, sur les Jeux olympiques à Londres. Et maintenant, je vais parler en anglais parce que ça sera plus facile pour vous et même pour moi. I'm going to talk through, first of all, I think the context of the Games and my involvement, and prochain. And then I'll talk about the planning phase, the implementation phase, and the legacy phase. I hope I'll answer some of the issues that have been raised by Marcus in advance, but I hope to leave as much time as possible for discussion. Discuter, pas écouter. Prochain, s'il vous plaît. I think you know all this. Marcus introduced me. Prochain. The London 2012 Olympic bid was always as much a social, economic, and urban objective as it was a sporting one. These 2 maps show the challenges facing East London. I know the East-West configuration is quite similar in many Northern European cities. The site of the London Olympics, which I'll point to, there, is between the 4 of the most deprived neighbourhoods, 4 of the most deprived boroughs in the United Kingdom, not just in London. Only a short distance away from the wealth of Canary Wharf and the wealth of the City of London, we have some of these very deprived communities, which have been the area where, during the 19th century, industry was moved out of the centre, moved out east, so they have the levels of poverty and contamination you might expect. And you can see on this right-hand slide a spatial syntax presentation, the extent to which the urban form, the urban grain, stops when you get to the Lee Valley. And prochain. And the Lee Valley itself, this is the situation of the location of Stratford in 2005. I'll just point at things because I need to stay near the microphone. On the left, you can see the state of the site, which was a mixture of industrial land, heavy utilities, railways, sewers, power lines, switching yards, and quite a lot of derelict land that had been left behind. And you can see the ground level picture, the towers of the global financial centre of Canary Wharf in the distance, and in the front a pile of scrap metal. So it had this very deprived situation, and I think the perception of the Mayor of London then, Ken Livingstone, who was not necessarily excited by the Olympics, he saw this as an urban planning opportunity, saw this as an opportunity to generate investment from central government and to accelerate and enhance the process of redevelopment of this part of London. And that was a central element of London's bid. Prochain. So all the way through the bidding period, we worked on two plans in parallel, and one reason for that I'll come back to was about powers. And these were the original, I think, bid period plans for the games and the legacy period. On the left, you can see the plan for games times. You see how the venues have been arranged around the central spine formed by the river valley and by the green spaces. And the areas in red and pink are either temporary venues or back-of-house facilities, security, all the tented accommodation that grows around the edge of an Olympic precinct. And so the idea was, after the Olympic Games, those would all be removed. Anything that was not going to be used permanently would be taken away, and I'll come back to this. There was the attempt to maximise clarity on what was permanent and what was temporary. And new areas for development, the ones numbered here, would open up around the Olympic facilities themselves, which would be converted to a legacy arrangement. And essentially the area would be plugged back into the city. Might be easier. Sorry, I'll get bored if I can't use my hands. So essentially, and people have already used these phrases twice, it was restoring something that was extraordinary, the extraordinary condition of the Olympic Games, into something ordinary, resurrecting the city and breaking out what is a necessarily secure precinct during the Olympics into something that can reintegrate parts of the city. And these are one of the diagrams that one of the architects came up with just to explain that process, which is what I'll try to talk through the phases of now. Prochain. So planning started in 2003 to 2004. London had, well, the UK had two Olympic bids previously, one for Manchester, one for Birmingham. And I think the perception from the International Olympic Committee was London was the only serious place they would admit a bid from. London, however, until 2000, didn't have an integrated city government. There was no one to sign the Olympic bid. There was no mayor. So it was in 2003, 2004, when Ken Livingstone started discussions with Tony Blair's government that we actually put together the structure for a bid. And I think there was some learning from previous Olympic bids in the UK, but also learning from big capital projects in the UK, many of which had a history of running over budget and over time. For example, the Jubilee Line extension, which was a big project, finished only just in time for the Millennium. The Millennium Dome, which was a successful construction, but was very unclear what it would do for legacy. And people were also watching the experience of Athens, where preparations for the Olympic Games were running very, very close to the wire and with very little clarity about legacy. So in London, I think in every city for a grand project, you're always considering what are the mistakes you're trying to avoid. Those were very present in the minds of civil service and government. So some of the big issues during the bid period was, first of all, as I showed, the Olympic Park site, and the advantage of the Olympic Park site is it could offer a compact area with high degree of land, good land availability. But the challenge was it's on the edge of 4 different local authorities. Each local authority in the UK system has its own planning committee, so you would risk having different planning regulations being applied to perhaps even different parts, not quite different parts of the same building, but to neighbouring parts of the same precinct. So one of the first things we did was get together the 4 boroughs around the Olympic Park and persuade them to undertake not a joint but a synchronised planning process, so that when we submitted the bid in 2014 we could say to the International Olympic Committee, we have already got planning permission, this is already approved. That was challenging because none of the local plans envisaged an Olympic Games. It's not a standard planning typology, so there was a big challenge in terms of creating the policy space for that to happen. And that connects, I suppose, to issues of programme, prochain s'il vous plaît. We realised quite quickly the programme for building the Olympic Park was going to be extremely tight, particularly because we need to do a lot of land acquisition, land purchase, and a lot of significant infrastructure work, particularly there are electric power lines across the Olympic Park which would need to be taken down to enable the construction of the venues and in particular the stadium. So we had to start work in anticipation of winning the bid or in anticipation of delivering a regeneration programme. So all the way through the preparation period, we started the London Development Agency, which was the Mayor's agency for big urban projects, started that out on building the preparatory works and doing the land assembly on the basis that even if we didn't win the Olympics, and I think there were some people in the London Development Agency who hoped we wouldn't win the Olympics, even if we didn't win the Olympics, we would be able to take forward a big urban project in that area. So that was very important. Prochain, s'il vous plaît. Powers, I mentioned the role of the London Development Agency. Of course, in the early days, we didn't actually have powers to deliver an Olympics. So there was a need for extremely rapid legislation after we won the bid. And we actually managed to get an act onto the statute books in under a year, which set up the delivery structures. But that was all drafted before we submitted the bid. We started off with the idea also that in terms of park and venues we would have no white elephants. As I mentioned, we've been looking closely at Paris's example, even at Sydney's example, even to a certain extent some of the aspects in Barcelona's Olympics, and there have always been some facilities that are left behind that have an unclear legacy use. And we were very clear in our intention, and I'll talk in a few moments about how intention and reality diverged, but we were very clear in intention that unless we had a clear permanent plan for every venue, it would be temporary, it would be taken down after the Olympics. And lastly, I think a lesson we'd learned from Sydney in particular, we decided to establish very resilient staging structures, as we called them, which were the governance mechanisms for running the Games construction programme. Prochain, s'il vous plaît. So these are the delivery structures we came up with, and we quite often talked in this way of the Olympic Delivery Authority, a statutory body accountable to government, as the organisation that would build the stage, and then the organising committee, a private body with accountability to the mayor but also to the Olympic movement, as the organisation that would put on the show. And these organisations have, by design, very different priorities, very different objectives. For the Olympic Delivery Authority, as a government body, its objective is not to spend too much public money and, as far as possible, to ensure good legacy. The organising committee of the Olympic Games wants to have the best possible Olympics, wants to have the best experience for athletes, for audiences, for advertisers, for all of the Olympic family. So we brought these organisations together in the Olympic board, comprising the principal political and sporting authorities, because we'd seen how in Sydney they'd had to bring the Olympic Transport Authority, I can't remember exactly, they had to bring the public agency and the organising committee together at the end because they were internally in trench warfare, there was internal problems between those two organisations and their objectives. So we set up this Olympic board which survived a change of mayor and a change of government as a forum for agreeing objectives, agreeing priorities, resolving differences. And we also put these organisations into the same building. That may sound simple, but it was actually having people that if you wanted to have an argument, you could walk across a floor rather than having to telephone someone or fix up a meeting. That was very important. So these three organisations, together with the London Development Agency, which bought the land, were co-located, and while they had their own governance structures, were ultimately answerable to a board that comprised the principal actors. I think that's probably where I'll pause on the discussion about planning, and people can ask questions, and then we'll come back. Thank you.
Alors, qui veut commencer la première question par rapport à cette phase? Peut-être un membre de notre commission ou...
Bonjour, Camille Picard de la Caisse des dépôts. Vous mentionniez le fait que vous souhaitiez maximiser l'héritage tangible à l'inverse du temporaire. Est-ce que finalement le temporaire n'était pas aussi considéré comme une opportunité ?
if I understand the question correctly, we wanted to use the temporary structures. Some of them were sold on to Rio for the Rio Olympics. Some of them I think we used for other events across the United Kingdom, so they were quite lightweight structures. I mean, the challenge came when, and we'll talk a little bit more about the stadium, is when what was designed as a semi-temporary structure had to become much more permanent, and that is obviously a construction problem. Have I answered the question correctly?
Merci.
Catherine, oui, on se lève aussi, bravo. Catherine Barbet, Société du Grand Paris. Est-ce que vous pourriez nous en dire un peu plus sur l'état du foncier, c'est-à-dire des propriétés sur lesquelles ont été construits les sites olympiques, à qui ça appartenait, comment s'est fait le processus d'acquisition et qui aussi a dépollué ces sites qui, je crois, devaient être extrêmement pollués également?
So the sites were in multiple ownership, quite complicated ownerships, and there had to be quite a lot of work done to actually work out who the owners were for some. It was largely in use for industrial land. It was largely in private commercial hands. There was some being used for housing. There was a site towards the north which was a cooperative housing site, and there were some traveller sites, Irish Gypsy traveller families sites nearby there as well. So, I mean, and this is a problem, these were perhaps some of the more marginalised people in London who were living in these areas, people with very little power. And so there was a process of compulsory purchase, which is quite a complex statutory process in the United Kingdom where you have to demonstrate, and again this comes back to the need to demonstrate the regeneration value as well as Olympic value, to demonstrate that there was a plan for using this land, that the plan could only be achieved by assembling all the land, and that you had made reasonable efforts to negotiate open market value trades with the individual landowners. So that was started in 2005. It completed in 2006, and I think vacant possession of all the land was in early 2006. But that again was essential because once you start burying power lines underground, you need to have the land. So it was a complex process. I think it was an expensive process, and the budget did run over for that element because there was some people got a very good deal, some of the landowners. But it was, and I think that was one of the areas where it was very important to start early. In terms of contamination, there was a reasonable level of awareness that, again, when they did early investigatory works, they looked at the contamination. Most of the land was, a lot of the soil was cleaned up on site using complex processes involving microbes that like eating petroleum that I don't understand myself. But I think about 95% of soil was retained on site and cleaned on site that was taken out. And the site has been capped below a certain number of metres. It limits now what type of construction you can have and also what type of vegetation you can have. Trees with very deep roots, for example, are not permissible on site now. But it was a successful and I think quite advanced in terms of the technology used process of cleaning up the site.
Thank you, Richard.
Merci. Alexandra Rossi, donc groupe SNI Grand Paris Habitat.
Si vous pouvez
je me lève,
s'il vous plaît.
Pas de problème.
C'est pour la caméra.
Merci. Du point de vue de l'héritage et donc des programmations post-JO, comment avez-vous élaboré l'héritage? Y avait-il des planifications existantes sur le site? Avez-vous achevé complètement les programmations? Avez-vous laissé des programmations inachevées en vous demandant, en laissant la possibilité au contexte post-JO de faire évoluer les programmations, ou tout était-il figé avant l'arrivée des JO? Et ensuite, comment avez-vous négocié avec qui ces programmations? Je crois qu'il y avait un programme de renouvellement urbain plus globalement sur le site. Donc, comment les négociations se sont faites et avec qui?
Okay. So we I think the answer is we wanted everything to be slightly more fixed and slightly more clear than it was in the end. I think we weren't able to fix things as much as we wanted. And as I'll talk in a moment, as the games got nearer, the urgencies of delivering for 2012 overtook the necessity of planning for the longer term. I think initially, the mayor said he would be responsible for legacy in the long term. The Olympic Delivery Authority had, as it's part of its statutory role, to consider legacy use for the venues as part of its role. But I think they became quite focused on what needed to happen for the Games, which is why, and I may talk a bit more about this in the next section, why in around 2008 we decided we needed to set up a designated legacy body which could act as a legacy champion. Because at the moment you were designing for end users and you didn't quite know who those end users were going to be. So it was very hard to have clear accountability. So I think this was an excellent structure for delivering the Games. I don't think it was. I think we should have thought more and earlier about delivering the legacy. And with most of the venues, for example, the aquatic centre was always going to be we need the big competition-graded swimming centre. With some of the venues, however, with the stadium, I think the differing discussions about what the legacy would be were quite complicated. And I think the challenge, however, is sometimes it's very hard to see in 2005 what demand will be for a particular type of building in 2014 or 2015. This is a very long planning framework. So there was a reasonable amount of planning done. Some of it turned out to be wrong. And I think if there had been a stronger planning body from the start, that would have been easier.
Merci.
Bonjour, Anna Perroux, Grand Paris Aménagement. Je voudrais savoir si vous avez pu, dans ces phases de planification, concerter avec les gens qui habitaient sur place et les entreprises sur place.
Yes, we did. I mean, there were two layers of consultation. I guess there was the consultation with the people who were directly affected, and we had a lot of consultations there. The travellers, we re-provided quite well-equipped caravan sites for them nearby. That's quite complicated because a lot of, I think you could only call it racism, exists towards traveller communities in the UK. So it's very hard to find alternative sites because local communities tend to resist that. But we found those nearby. The people who were in the cooperative, there was a movement, there was quite a political movement within the cooperative. Some people wanted to leave, some people wanted to stay. So there was again a negotiation about relocations. Some people were unhappy to the end about the relocation and still protested the Olympic Games since. So we didn't make everyone happy and didn't agree with everyone. I think for the local communities around there, it was a slightly different discussion. It was more about what they would like to see happening after the Games, what they'd like to see in terms of the legacy. And sometimes we had sensible discussions, sometimes it was a bit naive. I remember standing in a marketplace talking to people about what we would use the stadium for after the Olympics. Well, that's a silly question in a way because other people will decide what the stadium will be used for. So I think as the discussion got more mature and we talked more about what type of housing is needed, what type of facilities for young people, that became a better discussion. In the initial phases, a discussion about mega venues and mega events is very hard to have locally. People want to know, how do I get tickets for the boxing? How do I get tickets for the athletics? And am I going to be able to visit it for free? That was the level of discussion. I think as the legacy plans evolved, there's been more better discussion, however.
Encore une question.
Bonjour, Franck Balzer, établissement public foncier. Une question sur la London Development Agency. Sur ce schéma, elle est complètement connectée au maire de Londres. Est-ce que dans la réalité, il n'y avait pas un certain nombre de prérogatives qui étaient liées au gouvernement également dans sa capacité d'acheter le foncier, justement?
I think the mayor needed the government support. It was quite complicated, the situation in the early 2000s, because Ken Livingstone was a member of the Labour Party, and when they did from the left of the party, This is relevant context, I think. And when they had their first selection for a mayor of London, they fixed it so he didn't win. I think that's the only way of describing it. And then he ran as an independent and won as an independent. So the relationship between him and the leadership of the Labour Party was very difficult for some years. He had a good relationship, however, with Tessa Jowell, who was the minister for the Olympics. And I think he agreed that he would take on a considerable amount of the risk of running the Olympics, the financial risk, and would fund the bid through the London Development Agency. So the government was prepared to support a bid as long as they weren't having to write all the checks. I think in terms of the Compulsory Purchase Act, that is fundamentally, the process is an agency that has the powers, like the London Development Agency, makes an order. It has to be confirmed through a process of a public inquiry with a formal planning inspector and lawyers involved. I think then the Secretary of State may have a formal role in approving it, but that's only a formalistic role. The decision is essentially through the local and regional agencies. But the government, I'll talk a bit more about budgets in a moment, and the government was very important, particularly when, after we won the bid, we realised that we didn't have enough money. We'll come back to that.
Merci Richard. Je pense qu'on prend encore une question et on continue. Je vous rassure, vous avez encore beaucoup de temps après pour poser des questions. Qui voudrait, peut-être quelqu'un du public, poser une question?
Okay, I'll talk now about stages during the delivery process, and to a certain extent we've already touched on some of these issues, and I suppose there's no clear distinction between the issues that came up at one point and issues that came up at another. The first big issue that hit after we won the bid, it was obviously a difficult time, we had a terrorist attack 2 days afterwards in London, was the budget. We'd set this budget for the bid of £2.375 billion, which had a few small problems with it. And one was, it was based on the assumption that a lot of the venues, the capital costs could be met through undertaking public-private partnership schemes. But when you start talking to people about such schemes, they would point out that actually you need 3 or 4 more years than we had in order to plan and in order to develop the specification and the competitive framework. We didn't take account of security costs. We hadn't really taken account of tax implications. To a certain extent, that's a net zero issue because it's government agencies paying tax to government on. But at the same time, you can't just get these. You have to take account of those. You have to put the budget there, and the budget assumed that a lot of projects like the burial of the power lines could be undertaken through other regeneration funds. So the 2.375 billion was quite narrowly focused on what needed to be done simply to build the venues. So they had to have a big process of rethinking, and it was described as Operation Raven, a very secretive name. It was a very secretive process until the conclusion was announced, because of the legend that the ravens, the birds at the Tower of London, if they leave, London will fall. And I think we all felt we were going to be sent to the Tower of London when they heard the new numbers. So eventually a new budget of £9.3 billion, so more than 3 times the original budget, was set. I think one of the very wise things about that was it included more than £2 billion of contingency funding, because I think that the mayor and the minister agreed that they could go back once and take one hit in terms of the budget, but then they wanted that to be it, and it was a budget that we stuck within by the end of the period. So that was the first big challenge, and that took about the first year. There was a lot of work to re-engineer the designs, and this is when you start perhaps having people worrying less about the legacy use of things and more about how they can keep costs down in the present. The second big challenge was about procurement and contract management. It is quite boring and technical, but actually vitally important how the risk was managed. We couldn't afford to have a situation where through seeking very low bids on fixed price contracts, we would find ourselves with dates slipping. So through appointing a strong consortium of programme managers to run the whole programme on site, and B, through operating shared open book contracts where profits and losses, such as they were, would be shared, we could have a much more collaborative approach to procurement, a more collaborative approach to the construction process. I think if we'd taken any other procurement strategy, it would have been very difficult to achieve construction on time and on budget. The other big challenge was about legacy ownership of the stadium, and this is a story in 3 parts, I guess. I'll tell part 2 now. When the Olympics requires a stadium of a capacity of 80,000 strong. It's always one of the most complicated venues. I think one of the things we thought in 2004, one of the strong advantages Paris had was that you had the Stade de France already built, so that was already here. And we had various discussions about how it could be used. I mean, the obvious only rival to the Olympics in the UK is a football team, a Premiership football team. And so we looked at whether a football team might take it on. Now, we had discussions with West Ham, who are the local team in East London, about whether they would agree to take it on after the Olympic Games and would pay, I think it was around 100 million in those days' prices, towards readying it for conversion to a football stadium, which affects everything from seating to toilet facilities to roofing. And they weren't willing to pay that money at that time. And I think it's quite lucky we didn't take that commitment from them at that time, because they were then owned by 2 Icelandic billionaires, and those Icelandic billionaires in 2 years' time weren't Icelandic billionaires anymore. We in the end had to go through this slightly compromised idea for the stadium, which was the community stadium plan. The idea was you'd have this superstructure that built it up to 80,000 seats, and then you would take it down to 25,000 seats afterwards, and it could be used for athletics events, and it could be used for other perhaps lower grade football, rugby matches, and other uses. But I think this was left quite undefined. But it did define the structure of the stadium, where it was only the base of it, the podium there, that was built permanently. The rest of it was built out of demountable steel. So that was a challenge. We got a plan, but in the end that was one of the areas where we had to start letting contracts in 2006 or 2007, I think. So we couldn't actually keep the design issues open. They had to shut it down one way or another. In retrospect, perhaps the government should have taken the risk of converting it to a football stadium up front. It would have been a lot cheaper in the long run, but I think it would be very hard to argue that in the financial circumstances I've just described. We also started thinking about legacy planning more clearly, and this comes back to one of the questions I was asked. The London Development Agency was in place, but had a lot of projects across London, and I think the government didn't have particular confidence in it. So we agreed to set up this joint Olympic Park Legacy Company, OPLC, joint legacy company. This was set up agreed in the months after Boris Johnson took over from Ken Livingstone as mayor. And I think he suddenly realised that there wasn't a lot he could do about the Olympics, but the legacy was going to be what he would be remembered by, and he needed to focus on that. So we decided to set something up originally as a regeneration company, essentially a publicly owned private company structure with no particular powers, but the powers to own the land, to enter into deals, and to manage the legacy use of the venues. When there was a change of government in 2010, of national government, in discussion with Boris Johnson, the then Mayor of London, they agreed to set up something more considerable, which was the London Legacy Development Corporation. Development corporations have existed, most notably, I suppose, the most notable one in the UK has been the one in London Docklands, around the area of Canary Wharf. They're quite powerful bodies. They can use compulsory purchase orders, they can take planning decisions, they can give financial incentives, they can basically act as very strong instruments to actually bring around big urban change. They are criticised for being unaccountable, undemocratic. The traditional urban development corporations were appointed by the government. This urban development corporation was appointed by the Mayor of London, so I suppose its accountability was one level closer to the population, but still not the same as an elected local council taking decisions. But the Mayor and government agreed that a development corporation was what was needed. So the first London Legacy Development Corporation was set up in 2012. The land was transferred into it, and the venues were transferred into it, so that as the Olympic Delivery Authority finished its work, it would hand everything over. And actually we agreed that we would take over the work of transformation from the Olympic Delivery Authority. So delivery authorities before the Olympics are always exhausted by the time the Games happens, and actually we'd be there ready to take everything on, to do the conversion works, and to start getting things ready for their permanent use. And so I was quite involved in setting that up through that period and shaping that structure, which was very much to bring about a legacy that was not just successful in terms of getting use of the venues, but also creating a successful new community and creating a heart for East London that would make a real difference to people living there. The last big challenge during the delivery stage, well, there are probably a million challenges during the delivery stages, but particularly a big challenge was what happened around 2007. Next, please. And as you can see there, our plan was to do quite a lot of procurement and construction would start around 2007, when lots of private finance would be very happy to come in and build various things. Well, obviously in 2007 there was a bit of a collapse of the financial system going on, and suddenly the availability of finance, particularly for the Athletes' Village, which we were planning for it to be privately constructed and then handed back to us after the handed back for the period of the Games, then left in private hands afterwards. That was no longer going to work. The Press and Broadcast Centre, similarly, the idea was it would be built as a long-term commercial facility and leased back to the Olympics during the period of the Games. Again, that didn't work. So the government had to, and this is where the contingency came in handy, had to step in and find financing to meet the costs of those facilities. I actually think it would have been very difficult, I think, even if there hadn't been the big financial crisis, to actually successfully build the Press and Broadcast Centre at that stage, because I think the level of interest was very much lower. So that was the other challenge, was actually having to step in during that very intense period of work around 2007 to rescue those elements of the project. And next. Oh, we got there. And you can see that's a very typically English picture. There's no sun shining, but it is quite a beautiful garden. And I think the Games itself was an incredibly successful event, and I think really changed, and I'll talk about this in the next section maybe, changed people's perception, not just of London as a whole, but particularly of this part of London, which for people who had a mental concept of Stratford in East London, it wasn't a very positive concept. So it really did start to change the image of the area, and that then started to change how we perceived our legacy plans. I'll pause for a moment.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this second part. Alors, est-ce que nos membres de la commission veulent commencer avec une première question?
Merci. Martine Rhodes, CNRS. Pendant la phase de mise en œuvre en fait, de ce projet, il y a eu évidemment la crise financière internationale et la crise des crédits qui a particulièrement affecté le marché immobilier britannique. Est-ce que vous pouvez un peu expliquer quel a été l'impact de la crise sur le projet et comment vous avez réagi à ces conséquences?
I have to be slightly careful here, because during the period of 2006 to 2008, I was actually working freelance outside of this project, so I wasn't directly involved. It was in 2008 I suddenly thought, oh my God, I need to get a real job again. But I think during that period, I think and there was, and it probably did help in some ways to keep some of the contract costs down. It did actually help to cushion the blow in terms of London economy. You can see it, particularly in the construction sector. It kept the construction sector more resilient in London than it might have been otherwise. So I think that was positive, and the money was there. The money was allocated from government. Most of it wasn't dependent on either specifically on specific taxes or certainly on market conditions. I think it did require a rethink of some of those venues and some of those procurements. So I mentioned the Press and Broadcast Centre and the Athletes' Village. I think the Athletes' Village would have worked better and probably more efficiently if it had been built as a private housing development and leased back during the period of the Games. I think, on the other hand, the Press and Broadcast Centre, I think actually the people who were going to build it were part financed by Carillion, which is a big firm which is currently busy, just having gone bankrupt. I think the challenge with the Press and Broadcast Centre would have been being clear in 2006-07 what the demand for commercial space was going to be in the Olympic Park in 2013-14. And I think the risk premium we would have paid for someone to take that risk on would have been quite high. So I suspect that that may have been a better value outcome as it was. I think it also helped, through to the period of the games themselves, it also helped to a certain extent national mood during a difficult time economically. There was a genuinely positive feeling in London, which is quite unusual. Genuinely positive feeling in London during the 2012 games. People even enjoyed going to the stadium so that they could boo George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, when he came to open one of the events. So I think it did inject some positivity in that bit of London. I think it may, however, there's a sort of underlying narrative, and I'm stretching a long way forward from the games now, may however also have boosted a narrative which is about London getting all of the benefits of things in the UK and all of the investment. And I think you can see that narrative as underpinning some of the resentment of London that you could even trace through to Brexit. So it was a very positive moment for London, but I think there was also some rebound there.
Justement, sur le côté bénéfique et plein d'optimisme des Jeux Olympiques, comment avez-vous associé les habitants pendant la phase JO? C'est-à-dire, y a-t-il eu des mesures pour qu'ils soient bénéficiaires de l'emploi induit? Nous, on est un bailleur social, on a des habitants qui vont habiter à côté du futur village des athlètes. On se pose la question de comment faire en sorte de les associer à l'événement, au-delà des problématiques d'héritage, vraiment pendant l'événement, pour qu'ils puissent travailler et pouvoir bénéficier aussi économiquement de l'effet JO.
So there was a partnership also between the government and the local and the mayor and the local authorities, which worked with the 5 boroughs around the Olympic Park, 5 rather than 4 for technical reasons, but to seek to achieve socio-economic convergence between them and the rest of London. And they set up some indicators and a big plan of action. Now, that was a number, and I'll come back to what the results have been so far, but that looked at workforce opportunities, particularly construction opportunities during the preparation period, but also, even more so, construction opportunities in the legacy period and long-term employment opportunities afterwards. Partly because some of the construction on site was very advanced, technical, and involved, I think there were 11,000 people working on site at the height of the games. That demand probably couldn't be met locally, and actually getting people trained enough so that they could participate before the Olympics would be quite tough. So a lot of the people, we use the Olympics to inspire local people to see that construction careers are changing, that actually there's opportunities that aren't just about dirty, dangerous, heavy work, that some of it is quite precise, quite high skilled. So there was a lot of work done there. There was a job brokerage system we set up with all of our contractors, so that they would say, we need 10 people qualified to do this, and we would work with all the local job centres, work with the local outreach centres to find people who could fill those jobs. I think they were achieving around 10 to 15% local employment, long-term local employment, during the run-up to the Games. In Legacy, we achieved about 25% of construction and about 60 to 70% in managing the park and the venues. So it's an easier job. I'm not blaming the Games because that was a more difficult process. But I think what we found is quite interesting. Again, a challenge of procurement and a challenge of European procurement, to be honest, is to what extent you can specify socio-economic outcomes in your criteria, or whether that looks like that is being prejudicial against non-UK firms. And we had plenty of firms like Ferrovial came and got work. I think what we found is if we explained to people who are bidding for work that we wanted to see them come up with creative solutions as to how they can involve local people, they were very keen to do it, because local workers don't have transport problems, you don't have such problems with local community engagement. So actually we found the contractors were very responsive to finding ways of getting people into work and letting subcontracts to local businesses and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work done on the economic side. We also tried to run a programme, particularly while the park was still shut up, of involving local community groups in running events which in a way we could transplant into the park. So on sites just outside, we set up things like skateboard parks and things like that that could then be transplanted into the site, so the site could become part of communities. Another challenge in this area is it's an area that's quite dominated by territorial gangs. And one of the challenges, I suppose, was not to make the Olympic Park after the Games a contested place, which could actually result in violence and other problems. So trying to make it somewhere that had its own identity, that was actually welcoming to people from all around. And that's worked very well so far. I mean, there have been 1 or 2 incidents, but I don't think that was a challenge, was trying to make it welcoming, but not exclusively occupied by groups from one area.
Durant la phase de mise en œuvre, est-ce qu'il y a eu des conflits entre l'autorité chargée de préparer ce que vous appeliez the show et celle en charge de the stage? Et comment ont été arbitrés les conflits entre ces deux entités?
That was where the Olympic Board came in helpful. It was very useful. I think part of the conflicts were managed by a bureaucratic but very necessary process of defining clearly what the objectives of the project were up front. So it was very clear that the aim was to stage an excellent Olympics, so you have the tick from the Olympic Games lobby, but also to transform a whole area of East London, so you have a tick. So you would have almost the constitution to go back to and to refer to for the project. So that was one way of resolving conflicts, because you'd go back and say, well, but we did agree that this was an objective. I think there were, I don't know about all of the conflicts there were, I know about a few. There were plenty of conflicts, I think, about particular elements of cost and particular challenges. I think what was successful was those conflicts stayed private, and those conflicts were resolved through discussion rather than through people talking to the press or issuing public statements against each other. I think some of the challenges were about the stadium. My own opinion is that there is very rarely a cause for a large athletic stadium. London has an athletic stadium in Crystal Palace, which is very run down in the south of the city. I think one could have built a temporary stadium for the Olympics and then invested in the Crystal Palace stadium afterwards to create a really good athletic centre there. But it was very clear from, I think, the attitude of Seb Coe, the chair of the organising committee, that there needed to be a commitment to a track and field legacy in the Olympic Park. So those were areas of tension, and I think there were other voices that would have sought a different outcome there. But I think also, and I'm being slightly critical of Seb Coe, and he's a far more eminent figure than I am there, he was fully signed up to the socio-economic legacy as well as to the sporting legacy. So I think there was a degree of convergence, again to use that word, in terms of their objectives. I wish I knew more stories about big rows.
Vous avez parlé de contrats avec des repreneurs du stade, par exemple. Est-ce que vous aviez déjà identifié des opérateurs immobiliers sur les autres programmes qui ont été amenés à muter en termes de programmes de logement ou de bureaux?
So, well, the housing, the Athletes' Village, I think even though it wasn't delivered as a privately financed initiative, it was still delivered very much with the objective of this being long-term housing that are temporary use for the Olympics. I think there are specific oddities about Olympic Village housing, which is individual apartments not having kitchens because the athletes are expected to eat commonly, because I think for health reasons and for keeping an eye on doping issues, and also for the idea of the communal nature of the Olympics. So the flats were built in ways that were quite different from normal flats, but they were built by Lend-Lease, which is a big Australian construction firm, but financed by the government. So it was essentially a government housing project. Like all governments used to do a lot more of in the 50s and 60s, a big government housing project. And other elements, the stadium was built under a NEC contract, so a risk-reward sharing contract. The arrangements for the stadium subsequently have become more complicated. It's now owned by a consortium which includes the London Borough of Newham and is leased to West Ham as a football club. I think part of the reason for that was, again, a complication of regulation, that if it was handed over to a football club, to a single football club, that would be quite risky in terms of state aid regulations. Because why hand it to one football club rather than another football club if it's had all that public money put into it? So it's now held as a public asset, but leased to a football club, and it's a tricky situation still, the stadium. I mean, other facilities, and I'll talk more about the legacy ownership in the next section, and other facilities were generally built through a series of big construction contracts, and then their legacy ownership was determined through the legacy planning process in the years before the games. Was there a specific issue? I don't think I've answered the question very well. Was there a specific issue on contracts? Sorry. Je peux essayer de comprendre.
C'était plus sur la question des logements ou des espaces qui ont été réorganisés par la suite. Est-ce que vous aviez déjà anticipé à cette phase des éventuels investisseurs et donc bénéficiaires après les JO de ces espaces?
We anticipated basically a housing-led scheme, and the plans for the legacy, the empty spaces after the games were based on, I think, 10 to 12,000 homes, and the mixture about 50% affordable, 30 to 50% depending on the area, affordable, so subsidised by the government, and others for the market. I think one of the challenges in this area was that when people have been successful in East London, quite often the tendency has been to move out from East London, move out to Essex, to the areas on the edge of London there. So one idea was to try and create a better mix of housing. So you had some good family housing with 2, 3, 4 bedrooms, as well as apartments for single people. So just trying to change the mix a little bit and create housing that was aspirational as well as subsidised. I think that aspiration is still there, but I think what we realised after the Olympics and after the success of the Olympic and Paralympic Games was that actually we could do something a bit more, that we could create something that was a bit more of a civic centre as well as just a lot of houses, and that's the way the legacy plans are evolving now. But I'll talk through the different neighbourhoods and how that plan evolved a little bit more in a moment. Now someone who knows something about the Olympics idea.
Michel Salem-Sermanet de l'Institut Efficacity. It's going to be an easy question. J'ai eu la chance de travailler avec Richard pendant ces années, et je voudrais revenir sur un point qui est assez fort. Donc Richard a montré qu'il y avait une décision assez tôt de créer une structure dédiée à la legacy. Alors il y en a eu une première, donc Legacy Company, et ensuite une deuxième plus puissante encore, Development Corporation. Est-ce qu'avec le recul, tu peux dire que c'était une bonne idée d'avoir deux structures, une en charge de l'événement, une en charge de la legacy, pour être le champion de la legacy, ou alors est-ce qu'on aurait pu imaginer d'avoir au sein d'une seule structure les deux grands objectifs? Je pense que c'est un enseignement intéressant pour Paris 2024.
Yes, and I think Michel, when he worked for the Mayor of London, probably spent quite a lot of time trying to get the various children to play nicely together and not to squabble about legacy. So it's a good question. I think there's something just about the dynamic of it's quite hard work planning. I mean, I took 2 years out not working on this project in the middle. I think it's very hard for the same team of people to keep going all the way through from the beginning of the Olympics right through to the legacy. So I think part of it's about handing over to a new set of people with different ideas and perhaps different accountabilities. I think it would have been better if we'd brought the discussions together earlier. I think that would have been preferable. But I think actually having the different organisations, so you have that sort of dynamic of different objectives, is quite helpful. I think otherwise, in the run-up to the Games, legacy considerations would always be the thing at the bottom of the agenda, which you worried about after you worried about the contract you need to let tomorrow, the budget that's going over, all the problems that you have in a big construction project. So I think it does help having the different centres of gravity, if you like, but it's a good debate.
Pour continuer sur la question de l'anticipation de ceux qui vont récupérer une partie des logements, on a entendu pour les logements, plus spécifiquement sur les espaces publics, les ouvrages, je vais inverser un petit peu la question. Est-ce qu'au moment de la mise en œuvre, vous avez été amené à abandonner des ouvrages, des équipements publics, pas les majeurs évidemment, parce que justement vous n'avez pas identifié l'organisme, l'entreprise qui allait le récupérer, éventuellement parce que l'entité publique, autorité publique qui devait récupérer l'espace public ou l'ouvrage, dans des situations de crise a dit je ne veux pas récupérer dans 6 ans, dans 7 ans cet ouvrage ou cet espace public.
I think most of it being held by either the Olympic Delivery Authority or you have the basic construction of the venues, and then you have what you talk of as the games overlay. So these sort of the temporary facilities, the temporary superstructures put on during the Olympics by the organising committee. Most of those are either sold on as part of the organising committee's overall budget, or given away to community groups. So things like temporary seating and so on and so forth are all sold on. So those also done. I don't think there's anything that we couldn't find some after use for. I think one thing that I've not really talked about, which is a bit difficult to find after use for, is on the left-hand side of that slide, is the ArcelorMittal Orbit, which was I'm going to say some very nice things about Boris Johnson in a moment, so you can take this into account. It was a sort of fairly idiotic idea of this sculpture designed by Anish Kapoor using that very characteristic red paint he has that would sort of... It was a deconstruction of the Olympic rings, I think, and there's a viewing platform up the top of it where you can spend £15 and go and see the Olympic Park. If I was you, I'd go to the London Eye instead, the big wheel in London. And they've now put a slide on it, much to Anish Kapoor's irritation, because I think he thinks it's a serious artwork, not a fairground attraction. But this was Boris decided he needed to have something, I think it was the right idea, he needed to have something that was a bit more attractive, a bit more of a visitor attraction in the Olympic Park. And this was an idea that came during a conversation, I think, in the gents' toilet at Davos one year. And it's not making a lot, it's losing money every year, it's a difficult object to have. But the mayor was very determined, and I think he felt we were all being obstructive and visionless bureaucrats for opposing it, and so it's been built. So that was a difficult facility, but on the other hand, it's in the Olympic Park, so it naturally falls to the Legacy Development Corporation to look after it and maintain it and carry the small loss it's making every year. Sorry, that's very mean-spirited. It was a nice idea, but it was one piece that didn't really have a clear legacy use and isn't really attractive enough as a visitor attraction. I think maybe as the Olympic Park gets to its next phase, it will find more life.
Oui, Catherine Barbet, Société du Grand Paris. Moi, j'ai 2 questions concernant des équipements majeurs du site aujourd'hui. Je pense au centre commercial et puis à la gare de Stratford. Est-ce que, pendant la phase de préparation et de construction, vous aviez planifié un centre commercial aussi important et une gare de transport en commun aussi importante et complexe que ceux qui existent maintenant?
Sorry. What was the first part of the question? Sorry, I didn't... The first, la première,
oui, je voulais savoir si le centre commercial et la gare de Stratford avaient été prévus ou planifiés.
Thank you. Maybe, could we jump forward 2 slides? Because I could just point to things on the map, but forward. Yeah. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but so the advantage of one of the advantages of Stratford is it's extremely well connected. This Stratford station is connected to two underground lines: the Jubilee Line extension, which is comes up from the south, and the Central Line, which goes east-west. and to the Docklands Light Railway, which is a new light rail system, and through Stratford International to the high-speed service. Stratford International doesn't actually have any international trains stopping there right now, but one day maybe you'll be able to travel directly from Paris to Stratford International. But that was used for a high-speed service from King's Cross to the Olympic Park during the Games. Again, 7 minutes from King's Cross was an incredibly powerful thing to show the International Olympic Committee. So it's one of the best connected places in terms of mass transit in London. And that meant that there was no private parking anywhere around here during the Games. There were some park and ride centres on the outskirts of London, but nothing that came right to the Olympic Park. And everywhere on the site, I suppose from there to there is probably about 15-20 minutes walk. And the whole site was laid out so that it was wheelchair accessible, and the gradients were all manageable. Despite the fact there were some significant changes in level, the gradients were all manageable by wheelchairs. So it had a very good transport system. I think one of the mayor's objectives, Ken Livingstone's objectives, was probably to use the Games to force government's hand on some transport investment. So he also got the East London Line extension built, which goes across the park. That was one of these schemes, and I'm sure you have similar schemes in Paris that are always going to happen sometime soon when the government releases some funds. But government released funds for that, and released funds for a new ticket hall at King's Cross. And this was the advantage of the Olympic bid, was we tried at first to, I think the English word would be to fudge the discussions by saying, well, it's being considered, but it's not necessarily definitely going to happen. And the International Olympic Committee came back and said, no, that's not the answer. Either it is going to happen or it's not going to happen, and you need to make a commitment. So we also used the bid to lever out some more transport investment from government. So that was very successful. The shopping mall is basically all this, Stratford, Westfield. And I always say that Westfield Stratford was completed right in the middle of a recession and opened in 2011. And I don't think it could have done that without the Olympics brings attention to the site. Also, I don't think the Olympics could have worked without Stratford working either. So there was quite a symbiosis there. The challenge for us was that the Stratford scheme had planning permission in 2005, but the ownership of the facilities was not contested. It was split between warring parties who had different views on how to take the project forward. And so in the end, we had to put that was included in the compulsory purchase order, so that if they hadn't built it out, because that's the main pedestrian route into the park, if they hadn't built it out, we could have intervened, and actually it would have been the very odd situation of public authorities coming in and building a shopping mall for a private occupier. But it worked very well, and I think I don't love shopping malls much, but it provides a lot of local employment. It's a real magnet for the area, and I think it adds to the sense that this is a real civic centre, a real growing centre in East London.
Peut-être encore une dernière question avant de continuer dans la troisième partie. Non, si ce n'est pas le cas, donc we will hear the third part.
So, sorry, prochain, and next. So, the legacy plans. So we've touched on elements of this through the discussion. So we retained 5 venues in the park: the Aquatic Centre. Let's ignore the orbit for the moment. The stadium, Copper Box Arena, the Lee Valley Velo Park, and actually the Hockey and Tennis Centre above, as well as the Press and Broadcast Centre, which is marked as here east on this. As well as the Press and Broadcast Centre marked as here east on this slide. The legacy use of those has been different. I mean, the Aquatics and Copper Box are both managed on behalf of London Legacy Development Corporation by a social enterprise, a not-for-profit company called Greenwich Leisure. and they're managed as public sports facilities that also have competitions there as well. So the prices are pegged to the prices for local swimming pools. They're not at a different level, for example. The velodrome and the hockey and tennis centre are owned by Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, which owns the land going up further up the regional park and is a major, I suppose, urban to rural country park instituted in the 1960s. And I think there's a discussion about whether they would play a part in the longer-term legacy of the facilities as well. The stadium, there have been whole reports criticising how this process operated. There was a first attempt to do a competition for it, to dispose of it, to sell it, and West Ham and Tottenham Hotspur both bid. Sorry, let me step back. Around the time of the Olympics, I think it became clear that actually this idea of taking down this quite iconic structure from the Olympic Games and demolishing it and saying it's now a 25,000-seat stadium would seem like a very negative thing to do, and would also be very expensive because there would be no revenues coming out of it. So I decided to look for a football occupier. It was the first competition where West Ham and Tottenham Hotspur bid. That process ended up in trouble over state aid regulations, and we had to abandon the process. There was also quite a lot of dirty dealings between the various bidders, telephones being bugged, private security firms being employed. It was dirty business. So then we came up with this option that it would be owned and managed by the public sector, by the Legacy Development Corporation, working with the London Borough of Newham, and they would let it on a lease. And West Ham successfully bid for that lease, and I'll talk a bit more about it in a moment, but that's been operating now since 2016. Yes, 2016, as well as being used for the World Athletics Championships in 2017 and for some of the matches in the Rugby World Cup in 2015. The Press and Broadcast Centre we had difficulty with. I mean, it was a structure built to be as cheap as possible, sort of basically a big shed, but with very high quality cabling and infrastructure, IT infrastructure there, because that's of course been where the world's media had been during the Games period. And eventually we found a consortium who've taken that on, and actually the use of that is very positive now. It's got BT Sport, which is a sports cable TV channel. It's got the University of Loughborough, a big engineering university there. It's got another technical college there, and it's opening up as a centre for tech and new businesses. And when I talked earlier about that facility, I don't think that was quite the vision, and I don't think the vision they had would have worked then. And actually now there is a demand for those sort of facilities, for creative studio space in that bit of London. And if it's creative studio space that has really excellent fibre connectivity, that's extremely positive. And over here, I've not talked about the Olympic fringes. In Hackney Wick and Fish Island, you have, I suppose, some very artistic and creative sectors with a lot of studios, a lot of tech startups. So there's quite a symbiosis now going on between Hackney Wick and what's going on in here east. So I think that's working out very positively, and that's still in the process of being converted with more floor space coming on every year. And the Athletes Village was sold to Qatari Deer Lancé, and which is a consortium of private investors, and Triathlon, which is a consortium of third sector housing associations, and is being let out, 100% let, as a mixture of social affordable housing and market housing. And that's been, one of the interesting things there is the specification of the flats, exactly the same whether it's social housing or private housing. And actually the management levels of all of it are very good, but because it's all let at the moment, it's a slightly transient community, and I think trying to build around that some communities which will be more of a mixture of let and owned property is the longer term plan. So these yellow sites are the future development sites, where the new master plan looked at, I talked of a figure of 10 to 12,000 earlier. The new master plan has scaled back that number a little bit, though it still adds up to about 12,000 if you include the Athletes Village. And much more of a mixture of, rather than building big perimeter blocks to maximise density and maximise numbers. There's a lot more, particularly in some of these sites like Chobham Manor, focus on 2 to 3 story townhouse typologies, actually looking more like London terraces, particularly in that part of London, do. One of the challenges we have more broadly in London at the moment is that because we are moving so quickly towards more dense development, that where you have a new building site, you have this eruption of very tall buildings in a context that is very low to mid-rise. So we've tried to sort of moderate, I think, the extent of densification here while creating something that will have a critical mass. And in the middle of that, of course, the park itself, reduced in scale, re-greened. A lot more of it has been hard-standing circulation space, different planting, and made a lot more human in scale. And again, the scale of the type of concourse you need for the Olympics is very different from what you need for a wet Thursday afternoon in February when you're taking a dog for a walk. So the park has become something very different in character. Next, please. But there were challenges in delivering this type of legacy. I mean, I think the first challenge probably is thinking about momentum. And the great thing about the Olympics is that you have a date. In our case, it was 24th of July 2012. And having everything ready on the 25th of July 2012 is no good. And you can galvanise government and private sector and all sorts of agencies to work together to achieve that deadline. Without that deadline, there is a risk that you revert to traditional delay, rescoping, thinking again, finding ways of cutting the budget. So we tried to create that sort of pace in developing the legacy. So next, please. So we tried to set some very clear objectives and slightly artificial objectives. We said within a year of the Olympics, we will have started reopening the park. It's been too long for the people around the park to have been locked out of it. They were locked out of it in the run-up to the park. Unless they had tickets, they were locked out during the games. We need to give people access again. We need to reintegrate this into the community. So we set that 2013 deadline, not to reopen the whole park, but some of the areas in the north, some of the more natural areas of the park. And set very open public commitments as to how we would reopen the different venues. The whole park was opened by April 2014. And the stadium mid-2016, and obviously there's a slight pause in works there for the Rugby World Cup, a few gigs, and the World Athletics Championships in 2017. And the idea is that as well as hosting Premiership football during the winter, we'll be able to host a few big events, big concerts every summer as part of the package. And post-2016, obviously the major events programme is continuing, and all the venues are now fully up and operational, and the process is more about building out those legacy communities. Chobham Manor, the first one to the north of the site, has opened, and it's more about building out the second 2 phases, which are the ones around the Copper Box Arena and around the Press and Broadcast Centre now, the second and third phases of development. But there's also been a bit of a shift in ambition. Next, please. Which is this word Olympicopolis, which is a very Boris Johnson-esque word for a very Boris Johnson-esque proposition. Next, please. So, I think, sorry, these aren't as high resolution as I might have hoped. One of the things Boris certainly has, and he took over from Ken Livingstone as Mayor of London in 2008 to 2016, before he decided to help the cause of international relations. He has a keen sense of history, and I think he looked back at some of the big international events that London had operated before and thought these had actually amazing legacies that went further than perhaps what we were anticipating for the Olympic Park. So in 1851 we had the Great Exhibition sponsored by Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, which has left behind all the facilities in South Kensington, the big museums, the Royal Albert Hall, a whole street of cultural and educational facilities there. In 1951, we hosted the Festival of Britain, post-war, out of that post-war period of austerity, on the south bank of the Thames, where the Royal Festival Hall and the National Theatre is, the National Film Theatre. We hosted an exhibition of modern architecture, futuristic visions for London, for what sort of new world could be reborn after the Second World War. So I think there was a sense in the Mayor's office that actually just building quite a high-quality new housing scheme around the Olympic Park was a missed opportunity. And he started talking to people who might be involved in something more ambitious, and focusing on two sites. One, this site here, which is the Stratford waterfront site. So there's the shopping mall, there's the aquatic centre, and there's what you can see there. And also on a site a bit further to the south, just down there, which isn't actually shown with anything built on it here. And talked to a range of partners who agreed to come together to establish this, what he called Olympicopolis, after Albertopolis, which was the 1851 vision. His successor, Sadiq Khan, is not calling it Olympicopolis, but hasn't come up with a new name yet, so for the moment it has to be Olympicopolis. But has persuaded the V&A Museum, big museum of art, design and material culture, Sadler's Wells, the ballet and dance company, the Smithsonian, University College London, and the London College of Fashion, all to move out to this, to open new satellite venues in this part of East London. And I think that does show significant vision. I think if you'd said to me in 2005, we were looking at the site, that organisations of this kind of global reach and global reputation would be coming to this part of London, I'd have commended your optimism but wouldn't have believed a word of it. So I think that it really has shown how the image of this part of London has shifted and actually created an aspiration. I think it's a complicated programme. There are all sorts of hurdles before it's completed, but I think it is something that is creating much more of a civic centre and civic identity for this part of East London than the original legacy plans envisaged. And you can see that in the office space being occupied behind it. That is now going more and more to the type of offices that might otherwise be looking at locations in the West End, locations in the City of London. So a real game changer in terms of aspiration. Next, please. Stadium. I wish I wasn't talking about the stadium all the time because it's not the most exciting story. The stadium, the costs have been very high of the conversion. I think things that we didn't build into the original stadium plan because it was going to be temporary was a roof to cover over crowds during the not always perfectly sunny weather of an English winter. Retractable seating, so you could actually bring football fans closer to the pitch, much closer than they want to be for athletics. And such basic things as plumbing. I think I mentioned this earlier, but during athletics, people go and come and go to the lavatories at all different times. At football, you have tens of thousands of people, largely men, particularly with West Ham, all going to the toilet simultaneously. You need to redesign the whole system of waterworks, of sewage in a building like that. So significant rebuilding that, if it had been built in from the outset, would have been a lot easier. And the budget has overrun for that. There's been a big report done into how that's happened, and it's certainly been a big an issue that Sadiq Khan, the new Mayor of London, is very keen to shine a light on, perhaps largely because it's about his predecessor. And it's also not making the type of money that it was planned to make. At the moment, it's making a small loss. And West Ham are having problems with their fans who feel that they've spent far too much time moving into an expensive stadium and far too little on good football players. So it's seen some crowd trouble. It's a difficult part of the legacy at the moment. But I think the challenge is that I think very few Olympic stadiums have made great legacy facilities. I think even Barcelona, which did so well in terms of most of its legacy, the football stadium has not really had a properly viable use. I think, again, respect to Paris for having worked out the stadium use before you actually do the Olympics. So the stadium's been a big challenge, and I think will continue to be one. But I think it will get better. I think it's just teething problems at the moment. Commercially, there's been an ongoing tension, I guess, between what type of returns this legacy will generate, the affordable housing legacy, how much affordable housing one builds, how much one puts into subsidising cultural facilities to come into the area, the Olympicopolis scheme, how much one focuses on giving some money back. Part of the Olympic £9 billion was borrowed from the National Lottery, and there are some charities there who are very keen to remind everyone of the returns they've been promised in the long term. I think it's been very difficult that. I think maybe we collectively have been guilty of over-optimism that everything can be achieved simultaneously. But I think the balancing act has been broadly got right. I think there is a good balance of affordable and more aspirational housing. I think it is worth investing public funds into putting big cultural facilities into this type of part of London that they wouldn't naturally come into. And I think in the long term there will be returns, because I think that this coincidence of forces is creating the type of values that will see those returns in the longer term. We're also seeing some movement towards convergence in terms of social and economic conditions locally. Education outcomes are much stronger in the area. Employment rates are much higher, much more converged with the rest of London than they used to be. And job startups. I think some of the areas where there is still disadvantage in this area, earnings levels are still much lower than the rest of London. And ironically, given the Olympics, this area still suffers from above average levels of ill health and obesity and some of those type of indicators. So there are still significant social and economic challenges, but in terms of education, in terms perhaps of the younger generation who've grown up with this, it's a positive story. I think the last issue perhaps is what happens now. We're now 6 years away from the Olympics. We're as far away from the Olympics being held as we were when we won the bid from holding the Olympics. And I think people are starting to think, what's the long-term legacy arrangement? You can't have a development corporation in there forever. So I think some combination of returning things to local control, thinking what the long-term funding arrangement will be, because at the moment, I've not seen the detailed figures recently, but I think it's still not overall a money-making concern. So making sure you put in places that do preserve that park as a successful green space, do manage where the returns go from the future phases of housing, and there's still probably 10 or 15 years more of house building to go on, and do actually create somewhere which gets the right balance between preserving the memory of an amazing event in 2012, but actually also becoming an integrated part of the city and reuniting those urban quarters that were severed in the slides I showed at the beginning. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to talk more and debate. Thank you.
Catherine Barbier, SGP. J'ai eu l'occasion de visiter le site il y a 2 ans à peu près de cela, et j'ai beaucoup été très impressionnée par la qualité du parc en particulier, des aménagements, des promenades qu'il permet de faire le long des canaux. Bref, un très beau site, mais qui entretient ce parc, qui le sécurise aussi, parce qu'il est très grand et les équipements olympiques sont dans le parc. Bref, comment l'héritage sur ce plan de la gestion des espaces publics ou ouverts au public peut être conduit dans la durée.
It's a very good question. I mean, we got some very excellent park designers to come and work on it, including field operations, the people who built the High Line in New York, and clearly had that idea of creating something that was linear but also sort of animated and full of life. And with the contrast between the south, which is much more formalised and playful and more a collection of runs, and the north, which still has some more wild aspects to it. And we thought that was really important to get it right, the park right, because we had some consultants coming from New York, and they said, if you don't get this as a park that works for local people, for the local mother who wants to come somewhere to play with her children, it won't work for anyone. You need to sort of build it up as something that works locally first, and then as the area around it grows, you'll get more and more use, more and more people coming, and they'll bring life to it. The legacy management is undertaken by I'm going to complete blank as to it's a private concern operating under contract, and it is quite. I mean, the pounds per square metre for maintenance is much higher. I think 10 times the level that some other parks would pay. So there is a challenge as to how you keep it at that level. And I think that's one of the concerns about the exit strategy is how do you make sure that you can maintain something that continues to be maintained to that quality. In London, we had. After the GLC, the previous regional administration, was abolished, the Corporation of London, which is the financial services district, took over a lot of London parks. So they might be one option. Another might be Lee Valley Regional Park Authority, though they're used to a lower level of maintenance. Another might be the Royal Parks Agency, which now has more of a London presence. So I think it's a difficult question. It's an unresolved question. I think one of the things we've looked at is the extent to which the houses around the park could pay an estate charge that reflects the fact that by living near this public amenity, their values will be increased. So could they pay a certain amount of money towards that? That's been quite controversial when that's been done elsewhere, particularly when there's been controversial cases where those have been index linked and householders have objected very strongly to it. But it will be a mixture of public funding, but maybe some continuing cross-subsidy for some of the more commercial aspects of the site and maybe the people living around it.
Que sont devenus les logements d'athlètes? Donc, ont-ils été transformés, démontés et par qui?
They weren't disassembled, they were transformed. So all those blocks have been retained. I think, actually, one of the things is some of the blocks were built, athletes don't like going above 8 stories. I think because in Seoul they'd lived in high-rise blocks and they kept having problems with lifts and people had missed events because of lifts not working. So the IOC didn't want buildings above 8 stories. I think several of those buildings are 12 to 13 stories, so simply the top stories were left unused during the Olympics but were there for occupation afterwards. So all of that was built with conversion in mind. As I said, the main challenge was putting in kitchens afterwards, which you just had to put the kit in. The space was left there and there'd been provision made for all the services for the kitchen. So they were converted quite quickly and they are all now being let out, as I say, either through social rent or public or private rent. And I think it's working quite well as a neighbourhood. It's very high qualities of finish of the flats. They're also quite big space standards. In London we have a lot of problems with flats recently becoming smaller and smaller and the rooms becoming tiny. You can't really do that when you've got athletes, they're big people. So actually, compared to a lot of London apartments, they've got very good spaces internally. And I think it will be, at the moment it still feels a bit new, but I think it will become a successful district, particularly as some of the areas around it grow. Yeah.
Bonjour, Pauline Lavaux de Grand Paris Aménagement. Donc vous avez parfaitement démontré comment l'organisation des Jeux Olympiques a permis de transformer profondément et durablement un secteur de Londres. Et c'est évidemment une question qui nous interpelle dans la préparation des Jeux Olympiques à Paris et en Seine-Saint-Denis. Ma question concerne les populations qui étaient présentes sur le site avant l'organisation des Jeux Olympiques et la place qu'elles ont pu trouver ou pas dans ce nouveau quartier. Est-ce que vous avez dû faire face à des phénomènes d'éviction de ces populations, éventuellement les plus fragiles?
It's a very good question. I mean, the direct displacement of people living in the neighbourhood, people living on the site, was minimal. I think it was around 500 homes total, and as I mentioned earlier, most of those we found relocations. I think there were there's elements of displacement locally in terms of property prices going up and people who may have been able to afford to live in the area not being able to afford to live in the area anymore. And it's hard to disaggregate the Olympic effect from other effects of London's crazy property market in that, but it's significant. I think what we always said was that we wanted to achieve that we shouldn't be afraid of the idea of gentrification, and this area has always been an area where the poorest people have gone, and one shouldn't exclude the poorest people. One should make an area that actually has some success in it as well, that people who are successful don't feel like moving on always, so that we should seek to gentrify from within the local community rather than through displacement. I think there's a continued provision of social housing in the area, and we've set deliberately high targets for social housing in the Olympic Park site so that we keep that mix. I think a lot of local people have seen economic benefits. I think people have felt quite a lot of pride actually in what's happened in the area. But I think in any regeneration scheme, there are losers as well as winners, and I think one needs to be honest about that. I think our project was a lot less exclusionary than some other Olympic cities have been, and I think the people who were directly affected were compensated reasonably. But if you're operating on such a big scale, it will involve aggression towards individual rights. I think that's just a problem of big urban schemes.
Pour rebondir sur la question d'Alexandra sur la reconversion, qui a payé la reconversion, l'installation des cuisines, etc. Et est-ce que le CIO a contribué à ce budget de reconversion du village olympique?
No. The organising committee they agreed the rent they would pay for the use of those facilities during the Olympic Games, and it was a matter of I can't remember, it was, I think, not far away from 100 or 200 million pounds. I think the cost of building them was, these are very round numbers, and these are not comparable years either, was around 600 to 700 million pounds. I think the sale price that they sold them to Qatar did Lancé and Triathlon was about 300 to 400 million pounds. So there was a small loss to the public sector from the facilities, though that was always going to be, there was always a bit of a funding gap because the amount that the organising committee were prepared to pay for using them was never an amount that would make the development commercial, because they said, well, we're only renting them for a few months. You say, well, we're not going to put people in them in 2011 and then evict them in a year, and then so it's just somewhere there was a difference of opinion. I can't remember precisely who paid for putting the kitchen in. I think they were sold on without the kitchens in, and then the legacy owners put the kitchens in because, of course, they would know, they would be able to deal with their own suppliers and would be able to assure themselves of the quality. I think that's how it worked, but I'm not 100% sure. But it's difficult to marry what an organising committee is prepared to pay for and what things cost to build.
Bonjour, Claire Pevergne, Institut d'aménagement et d'urbanisme de la région Île-de-France, responsable du département sport. Je voulais revenir sur la question de l'héritage des grands équipements sportifs. Donc effectivement, on a bien vu que le stadium, c'était un peu compliqué. Je crois que vous avez même dû effacer la partie athlétisme parce qu'on sait que les footballeurs, les rugbyman n'aiment pas trop jouer dans un stade d'athlétisme. Donc on voit bien la difficulté d'anticiper l'utilisation à venir des équipements, et ça a un coût. Je ne sais pas si on est totalement en capacité d'anticiper ça. Il y a eu la salle aussi complètement démontable qui a été revendue. Moi, j'avais cru comprendre au final qu'elle a été revendue en Argentine, mais je sais qu'elle a tourné très longtemps. Il y a eu des occasions, enfin des offres faites, y compris en Île-de-France, mais qui finalement, par des collectivités, des EPCI, des intercommunalités d'Île-de-France, mais qui finalement ont abandonné parce que même en format temporaire, c'est des dimensions telles, ces équipements temporaires pour les JO, que finalement, c'était une gestion derrière beaucoup trop compliquée au quotidien. Et du coup, je voulais savoir ce qu'il en était finalement, notamment de la piscine aquatique, comment elle vivait aujourd'hui, comment elle vivait son insertion pour le quotidien, mais aussi, même si elle a été elle aussi redimensionnée avec beaucoup moins de gradins, est-ce que vous avez suffisamment d'événements d'importance pour l'exploiter et l'utiliser quand même à son niveau, et même chose pour la Copper Box?
I think I'd start maybe with the stadium and the challenges having the seats. That I understand, I'm not a great soccer expert, I understand that some teams in Germany and other countries are quite happy to play with an athletics track around the outside. It's just the culture of English football is very closed in, so it just doesn't work. So the seats are retractable, they can be, so every summer they can be taken out so that athletics can take place, but every winter they have to be put back in. And that's an expensive technology and an expensive process. But I think you're right, it's very hard to anticipate that. I mean, in Manchester, for the Commonwealth Games there, they did something slightly different. They dug down after the Commonwealth Games, so they dug the bowl further down, so it actually went further into the ground, so you had that closeness afterwards, but that lost the athletics track, of course, there as well. So it's not easy to find the solution that is going to work. I think the stadium is particularly difficult. There are very few things that want an 80,000 seat stadium, and the things that want it, which may be the Olympic Games and soccer, actually have different objectives. So it's difficult to reunite those. It might have been easier if that had been acknowledged earlier on in the process, but as the saying goes, we all have perfect vision in hindsight. So it's a perfectly understandable decision. I think in terms of some of the temporary facilities, I think some of those were, the basketball arena I think was sold off. And they are not that easy to sell off themselves because, as you say, they have such scale. I think the Aquatic Centre is a really good example of a facility which was genuinely designed for legacy and had a temporary use for games, because we put these two, it's a beautiful structure by Zaha Hadid, and we put these two wings on during the games which looked terrible, to be honest. But actually when we took it down, it had this amazing arched back and those glass windows. The only problem is, and I've swum in it myself, and it's amazing in two ways. It's amazing because you swim and then you look up and you're taking breath, and you're just so amazed by the ceiling and the structure that you then forget to swim, forget to breathe, and end up spluttering lots. And there was a problem though that the great windows, which are fantastic for the look of it, actually were shining. It was very hard to use it for competitions because there was too much light shining in swimmers' eyes. So again, one had to sort of change that. But I think that is. The Amateur Swimming Association wanted a 50-metre facility in London. It's astonishing there isn't a 50-metre facility in London. So it is used for national and has been used for European championships and the diving pool as well. If you go there on a Tuesday afternoon, it's not that busy. But there are people swimming lengths or widths, depending how they've got the pool arranged, and there are schools using it. It's not quiet. And I think that, in terms of its business plan, is not doing so badly in terms of revenues. It's also such a great iconic building that every other car ad in the UK on TV features a car driving very fast past it. So it gets quite good money from advertising as well.
Alors, on prend encore une dernière question et après on devra sortir de la salle pour 1h30.
Paul Lecroix, Institut d'aménagement et d'urbanisme aussi de la région Île-de-France. Richard, tu nous as vraiment fait un panorama très très complet de l'organisation des JO et de l'héritage, mais tu nous as pas beaucoup parlé des fringes. Et quel a été votre rôle pour les fringes, et notamment des choses qui n'ont pas forcément été aussi bien réussies du côté de Stratford High Street et dans ces coins-là? Quel a été justement le rôle des boroughs sur ces fringes? Est-ce qu'il a été le même qu'au cœur du parc? Puisque si j'ai bien compris, l'ensemble du périmètre sur lequel tu as travaillé, c'est 240 et quelques hectares. Est-ce que je me trompe?
I'm not sure about that number, but of 240. But can we go back maybe to the slide with the map, just so I can? Yeah, thank you. So we deliberately, the red line on this shows the boundary of the Development Corporation in terms of its planning powers, and it was deliberately broader than the Olympic Park itself. And as we mentioned, this area, Hackney Wigfish Island, because it's located between a big motorway on one side and the canals on the other side, it's one of these areas that's become a sort of closed off, almost a secret garden of artists' communities and so on. So that's actually an area that was operating quite successfully, but not, and it wasn't perhaps a sort of typical long-standing East London community. It was tended to be artists who may have been priced out of other parts of the city as well. So sort of bourgeois bohemian types. This area down here is more industrial and social housing, and these areas much more family housing up towards that end. So there was a whole programme of work done by the Development Corporation on fringe projects to try and master plan and think about what the process of urban change was going to be in these areas, to try to particularly manage some of those forces of displacement and pricing people out that would tend to take place if the market just took its course. So in Hackney Wigfish Island, they worked on strategies for affordable workspace. So there'd be percentages for affordable workspace, and on preserving some of the urban typology of the area, that sort of yard spaces surrounded by workshops that had been very characteristic. Other projects were at this big walkway coming down here, down to the River Thames, which is around there at the end of the carpet. So this big, so you can actually walk now pretty well the whole length of the Lee Valley. It'll take you 2 days, but to bring this idea of there being this amazing river valley in East London through. And a lot of work around here trying to work out some of the sort of urban linkages, trying to connect things in. I think some of the challenges, I mentioned the motorway there, is just up to the north where it says Waltham Forest. you have areas there which are very near to the Olympic Park, but are severed from it by a motorway, power lines, and railway yards. So some of those challenges haven't been fully dealt with yet, but I think they're longer term. So there has been a program of trying to sort of manage the process of change around there, and I've always said that the success of this will be when you actually walk from Hackney Wick into the Olympic Park, and it's perhaps harder to see where the boundary ever was, because it can't just be about the Olympic Park's extraordinary character informing the areas around it. It needs to be two-way traffic, so this becomes part of East London.
Thank you very much, Richard. Merci beaucoup à vous tous, aux membres de la commission, au public. Merci beaucoup pour l'excellente organisation à Clotilde aussi. Et bien sûr nos techniciens qui ont fait un travail magnifique pour enregistrer en fait cette présentation très riche qui va nous donner un matériau de réflexion pour très très longtemps. Donc on va clore aujourd'hui cette audition internationale, mais on va continuer, donc on vous tiendra au courant des prochaines étapes, donc pour les voyages en Chine. Donc je vous invite d'ores et déjà. En sortant, je vous prie, s'il vous plaît, de laisser vos casques en fait dans les bacs qui sont préparés. Et donc, je vous dis à la fois prochaine. Merci beaucoup.